I'm Carol Bacak-Egbo. I'm a special lecturer at Oakland University, and I'm also a project advisor for Oakland County Parks. My specialty is history. In fact, the history of the parks. All of our parks began as farms, so I research whose farm was it, who lived on the land, and what we've learned as I've been doing that work is that a park is not separate from the township where it exists. It's connected to that township. So in researching Springfield Oaks Park, I learned a whole lot about the history of Springfield Township. And I had the good fortune to work with some township officials to create a historical bus tour of Springfield Township that we put together in 2016 and we're hoping to recreate. My first task for the bus trip was to design a short presentation to build some context. We call context in history. Something to get people interested about the township before we put them on the bus and took them over several roads. So here's the task I set for myself. I said, we're going to be visiting 4 historic cemeteries. But I don't want that just to be, here's cemetery 1, here's who's buried here. I said, what if I find the connections? What if I find a way to connect those 4 cemeteries together? Because if I've learned one thing about local history is that when people came to Oakland County, came to a township, they became interconnected, intertwined as families married. So I thought that's going to be a good idea. Let me connect the 4 cemeteries together. Now, my problem was, where should I start? You know, historians, we don't get signs like this. Start here. Here's your starting point. We have to create our own starting points, and the starting point could be critical. I decided I would start with Bridge Lake Cemetery. That's just off Dixie Highway. It's originally the Springfield Village Cemetery. It's kind of in the center of everything, so I said that's where I'm going to start. So I started taking a look at the land around the cemetery. In fact, I wanted to see who owned the land where the cemetery was located. Bridge Lake Cemetery is right down there in that little triangle. In fact, if you look on some maps and some documents, it's called Triangular Cemetery. Well, notice that it was owned by Orange Powell. Oh, I like that name. Orange Powell. I'd forgotten it. Orange is sometimes a first name long ago. I said, I think I have my beginning family. I'll take the Powell family. So then I went out to Bridge Lake Cemetery, and you can see it's not a very big cemetery. You can see there's a lot of open space. There's probably way more people buried there than is evident now. Some stones that are flat, some that are missing. But I said, let me find Orange Powell. I noticed a couple large gravestones. I said, I'm sure Orange Powell's going to be one of them. It turned out it wasn't the tallest gravestone, but it was here by the tree. And as I looked closely, I noticed Orange Powell died 1863. He must have been an early settler. And his wife, Fanny, who died in 1866. So I had my family. I'll start with Orange Powell family. But then I said, wait a minute. Is there somebody else buried with them? Are there children? So I walked around to the back of the stone, and here was someone else buried with them, Rodney Lay. Died at Vera Cruz, 1848. Wait a minute, I said. What is Rodney Lay? Why is he buried with the Powells? His name is nothing like Powell. Died at Vera Cruz. Vera Cruz is not in Michigan. Vera Cruz is in Mexico. March of 1848. What was he doing in Mexico? Why is he buried with the Powells? This was going to be a mystery. But my historian brain kicked in, put the clues together, put the puzzle pieces together. Vera Cruz, 1848, the war with Mexico. He must have been a soldier, and he was killed in the War of Mexico. Well, that was a possibility, but historians go out and prove that. Then there was still the problem, why is he buried in Springfield Township with the Powell family? Well, that took me to a probate court in Wayne County from 1840s. I located a probate trial. In other words, when Rodney Lay died, he didn't leave a will behind. So probate court had to decide what was going to happen with whatever he owned. If it was land or a small amount of money, who was going to get that? So you'll notice up here the estate of Rodney Lay. Inside the folder with these documents was someone who became a witness. A witness comes and says, here's who I think should inherit the estate, and here's the reason why. Well, look who had signed and who was the witness, Orange Powell. There was my connection. Orange Powell had come to talk about Rodney Lay. And in his witness testimony, he said, I'm here to tell you that Rodney Lay is the son of Fanny Powell, my wife. So it turns out that Fanny had been married before, married to a Lay, and I'm not sure, I haven't found that person, but she had a son, Rodney. And Rodney was killed in the war with Mexico. And they had come to make testimony that she should inherit. But then I said, what did she inherit? Now I was off on a tangent, but I had to find out. That took me to the Bureau of Land Management. This is where we have our land records for land patents for Michigan. And I noticed in Kent County that 3 people had owned a piece of land: Rodney Lay, George Luther, and Fanny Powell. So Fanny must have inherited land. Now, it was an interesting piece of land. This was the land patent for the land. This is what we call a bounty patent. What had happened was some of the soldiers in the War of Mexico, instead of being paid, were given land in Michigan, particularly in areas like Kent County. So Rodney Lay had given a piece of land that he actually got after he had been killed. That land passed to Fanny Powell, his wife. Fanny Powell, his mother. Now, Fanny didn't need land in Kent County. She was living in Springfield. So what she did was pass the land over, assign it to George Luther. She sold him that piece of land. But now you can see I've got this connection I've solved my problem. Between who was Rodney Lay, he was buried with his mother and his stepfather. But wait a minute, I was off on a tangent. I was trying to connect 4 cemeteries. And my problem was I had spent all this time researching someone who was killed in the war with Mexico. I had to get back to work. My task, remember, was trying to connect all of these cemeteries together. I needed to get back on task. So I moved northeast to the Bigelow Cemetery. Bigelow was a predominant family in Springfield Township, and it was a family cemetery begun by the family, and then neighbors would use it. I went out to visit the Bigelow family. It was smaller than Bridge Lake Cemetery. Not many people buried here. Now I had to find my connection. I said my logical connection is to take a look at Orange Powell's family and find a Bigelow connection, because most of the people buried in the cemetery were Bigelows. So I said, how about if one of the sons married one of the Bigelow daughters? Well, right away I eliminated William Powell. Orange's son moved out of Springfield. So did Thomas Powell. They were in another township. That left me with Morgan. Yes, Morgan, I said. He married one of the Bigelows. But unfortunately, he didn't. He married Harriet Andom. So my theory fell apart. Now I had a problem. There has to be a connection, I said. It's all going to fall apart if I can't find a connection between the Powell family and the Bigelow family. I went back to the Bigelow family records, back to the cemetery, and got a different listing than I had before, and noticed at the bottom, with Edmund Bigelow and his wife Eleanor, there was a 3rd person buried with them, Mary Powell. Yes, I said, Mary Powell was one of Orange Powell's daughters. So it turns out that Edmund Bigelow, who was one of the first Bigelows here, had been married twice. He first married Mary Powell. She died in 1831, soon after the Powells had gotten here. And then later he married Eleanor Butler. That was my connection. I'd finally found it. Here we have Edmund James Bigelow, and then as you continue his family tree, Mary Powell, who was his first wife. I had done it. I had connected Bridge Lake Cemetery and Bigelow Cemetery. Now it was time to move on. I had to move to Springfield Plain Cemetery. Notice this one. It's even tinier. Every cemetery I was getting to was getting smaller and smaller. Why was that a problem? Fewer people were there. Fewer people that I could find for my connecting pieces. This was a real challenge. I tried different things, it just wasn't working. So I stopped and went back to Orange Powell's family tree. And I said, maybe I have to dig a little deeper here. Well, here we have Lieutenant Elisha Powell. He was a Revolutionary War officer, and he was the father of Orange Powell. As I researched the family a little bit deeper, I noticed that Diantha Powell, who was Orange's sister, She had actually come to Springfield Township with Orange Powell. They had traveled together. She had come with her husband and her children, and they had indeed decided to come to Springfield together. Common pattern in Oakland County. 2 or 3 family members travel together and take land near each other. Well, I had to find out about Diantha. It turns out her husband was Horace Green. She was Diantha Powell Green. But this was a Springfield early tragedy. Horace Green was clearing his land in 1833. He had just purchased it. He was clearing the land, and it turns out as he was knocking trees down, a tree actually fell and killed him. The historic documents say he was killed by the falling of a tree. So here was Diantha. She was in the Michigan Territory, which was pretty wild at that time, and she had lost her husband and was there with children. You'll notice here it shows just 2 children. That was inaccurate. This family tree was wrong. She actually had 5 young children. Well, I was fascinated by her story. I thought, I want to know more about her. How did she survive losing her husband, trying to raise 5 children? I wanted to know where her farm was. So I researched and found the land patent for the Green family. And it said they had taken land in 1833 in Section 12. So he had just gone to Detroit, registered the land, come back, and within the next 2 weeks was killed by the falling of a tree. I had to find out where that land was. I noticed this again, the 1857 map showed the Green farm. By now, of course, Horace was gone. One of his sons, Grantham, had taken over the farm and was using the farmland. There was also O.W. Winslow. I didn't know who that was, but here was the most interesting part. Right across the road from the Green farm was Springfield Plains Cemetery. Now it occurred to me, when Diantha Powell passed away, where's the logical place she's going to be buried? Right across the street. That could give me the connection I needed between the Powell family and Springfield Plains Cemetery, my 3rd cemetery. So I dug out the records of Springfield Plains, and there were 2 Greens there. Not Diantha, but Alicia Green, who was killed, who died, and I don't know how, in 1847. So she had lost another child. And then there was a Horace Green. That turned out to be Diantha's grandson. And he was named after his grandfather, who'd been killed by the falling of the tree. But those were the only Greens there. What about Diantha? And then I said, wait a minute, think about this, historian. You're in Michigan. Michigan isn't even a state yet. It's a territory. You have 5 young children to raise. What are you going to do? You're going to remarry. That was the pattern in those times. I said, Diantha is not a common name, and look who's on the records for the cemetery, Diantha Winslow. That's her, I said. It's got to be her. And sure enough, Diantha Powell Winslow. She died in 1856, was married to Wilder Winslow. You can see her stone is flat now, very difficult to read. Probably needs a good cleaning. That's a project we might want to take in Springfield Township. But now I found my connection. And interestingly enough, this solved my other problem. Remember the Winslow had a little piece of the Green farm? That's because that was Diantha's husband. So she was still farming. In 1857, she had just died, but Wilder Winslow had kept that little piece of farm. Well, now I had my connection. I had the 3 cemeteries connected, a perfect triangle. It was going so well. All the puzzle pieces were there. There was one little problem. Andersonville Cemetery, that 4-star. I'd forgotten about that 4-star. It was perfect until now. I had to find one more connection. Now, Andersonville Cemetery is a lot bigger than the other 3, which created a problem. A lot of people to sort through. I needed a Powell-Andersonville connection. Well, there are 600 people buried in Andersonville. I started through the records trying to find some name that would be familiar. some name that would connect to the Powells. I'd been looking at maps, I'd been looking at census records. I said, as I go through these names, some name will be familiar. So I started through the A's, the B's, the C's, the D's, got to the M's. It wasn't till the S's that my brain said, wait a minute, Simpson. I've seen that name before. Look how many Simpsons are here in Andersonville. This has to be a significant Springfield family. They were probably here when the Powells were here. Is there a connection? And why is my brain remembering Simpson? That took me back to the 1857 map. Here was Orange Powell's farm, and whose farm was right next door? D.J. Simpson. I said, that's the connection. There must be a connection between the Powells and the Simpsons. And that took me back to Bridge Lake Cemetery, because I had noticed there were Simpsons there. There were not many, not as many as in Andersonville, but there happened to be a Laura Powell Simpson. Yes, I said, Laura was his oldest daughter. She had married into the Simpson family. And this, in fact, that tall stone that I had looked at when I thought that might be Orange Powell, I hadn't gotten close, but I had taken a photo that day. I hadn't even remembered who was buried there. But when I look back through my photos, indeed, it was Laura Powell. This is interesting because she was Laura Simpson. But because I think she was buried where her parents were buried, they kept her maiden name, which is not done very often, but very cool for historians when that happens. So Laura Powell Simpson was buried where her parents were buried, not where the Simpson family was. But if you notice here, Laura Powell, the oldest, and right here again, the farms right next door. She had married the farmer next door. And then, but at Andersonville Cemetery, John Simpson, her father-in-law, Ora Simpson, her mother-in-law, were both buried, along with many of her nieces and nephews in Andersonville Cemetery. And that created my last little link. I now had the triangle connected with the fourth cemetery. Now you can see how these early settlers, how their lives intertwined, how they interconnected. As we find, starting with Bridge Lake Cemetery, I chose the best place to start, and it was just a piece of good luck that I started with Orange Powell, because that brought all the puzzle pieces together. And that's what I'd set out to do. This fabric that a township becomes, this intertwined weaving, this fabric with all of these people and their lives intertwined, and the stories, the rich stories that we have within the township.